All right, so this one, in reference to Dr. Peter Masters' recent article, and honestly, I can't tell from the article how recent it is, but maybe we can figure that out. Where he's talking about churches complying with, government orders and things regarding coronavirus, asks, are they right to follow in compliance since the UK seems to be making more allowances for churches over against bars as he references, but they still can't sing. Very puzzling.
Yeah, and abortion clinics. Let's address it based on the merits. And by the way, let me preface it by saying, if you asked me to choose, my favorite preacher, if I was going to be one of those people, who make memes about such things on Facebook, I would be really hard pressed to tell you who I like more. On a personal level, MacArthur, because I don't know Masters at all. We've never had a conversation. But Peter Masters is brilliant and steadfast. That's the way I would describe Masters, steadfast. So this is an unfortunate disagreement, but I'll address it the best I can. The article in question is at the Metropolitan Tabernacle website entitled, "Should Churches Comply with Government Instructions About COVID?" And yes, he takes a pot shot at Dr. MacArthur, speaking of, he doesn't name him, but he speaks of a California pastor who, etc. And by the way, he quotes Richard Baxter here, which I despise. I don't care for Richard Baxter at all. Like, his Reformed pastor was hot garbage. But anywho, Masters argues that it is a legitimate function of the state to tell churches what to do in certain circumstances. Now, MacArthur's new position and my position, and the position hopefully of most of you, is that Jesus Christ is Lord of the church, and that is a separate realm of jurisdiction. It's a separate authority than that of the civil magistrate. And so we render to Caesar what is Caesar's, like taxes to build roads and bridges and maintain armies, or at least raise armies when you have to. Let me put it that way. And there's the legitimate jurisdiction of Christ. And chief among that, within that jurisdiction, is the Lord's Day. I mean, it has his name on it. It's the Lord's Day and his corporate worship and his body. I mean, if Jesus doesn't have bodily autonomy, who does? Our position is submitting to the government in regard to restricting our free exercise of religion is to acknowledge the government as the head of the church. I could not be a good Protestant and believe that the government is the head of the church any sooner than I could believe the Pope is the head of the church. So the point of this article from Peter Masters at Spurgeon's church here is, let me find the line. Are there not two governments, he asks, the world and the church? Should we not be asserting obedience to the rule of Christ, refusing to allow our worship customs to be interrupted? By the way, it's not our worship customs, it's our worship commands. A Reformed Christian ought to know that because we believe in the regulative principle. And so Masters draws from the Confession of Faith, which I share. We have the same confession, which says, God, the supreme Lord and King of all the world, has ordained civil magistrates to be under him over the people for his own glory and the public good. Obedience to the civil magistrate ought to be yielded by us in the Lord, not only for wrath, but for conscience sake. And we ought to make supplication and prayer for the kings and those in authority. And he points out that the proof texts are Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, which I have discussed ad nauseum on this program and preached about. Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course they are. So Master says this is an oversimplification. Let me find the, here's the statement from Masters that I disagree with. Here's what he says. In matters relating to the body, law, and order, defense and public good, including public health, God rules his redeemed people along with the rest of the world through civil government. Now, before I get to what I think is wrong with that, I'm going to throw that to you, David. Do you see what I see in terms? What's the malfunction there in that statement?
Well, who's to say what is health? I mean, that's such an open-ended way to characterize it. You can technically justify just about anything the government does on the basis of what's good for people's health.
It's for the public good.
Yeah,
it's
of course.
For the public good. I think that Masters here, in my opinion, I would say the problem for me is it's the same problem that I took issue with in regard to Challies, Tim Challies, who said matter-of-factly that it's the government's job to protect public health. And, the Canadian says it, Challies, and the Brit says it, the brother Masters, Dr. Masters.
No, he twists himself into knots later in the article. I don't know if you noticed that.
As an American, I have to question their presumptions. I want to know where the Holy Scripture says the government's job is to protect public health. Right. Where does the Bible say that? Because Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 says it's the government's job to punish the wicked and praise the good, which is a matter of justice. The government's job is to kill murderers and to kill child molesters and to kill rapists, because it says the government does not bear the sword in vain, but it's a minister of God to bring vengeance upon all those who do evil against the Lord. So the government's job is justice, killing bad guys and praising good guys. Notice it doesn't say rewarding the good. It just says praising the good. And attaboy is the most the government should do, not, give people money or anything. Just praise the good and actively punish the wicked. The presumption that the government's job is to protect public health, it might be a Canadian notion. And
they can't do it anyway.
It might be a British notion, but it's not a biblical notion. And I'm sure they're screaming, "You're looking at the Bible through American lenses." Well, I'm a free man, and I am looking at the Bible through the lens of a free man. And Canadians and British are both peasants. I mean, they're serfs. The British have a queen, and the Canadians had a queen until yesterday, practically. Any group of people that is disarmed by their government are not citizens. If you're disarmed by your government, you are a peasant, and you are a serf, and you're not a free man. And unfortunately, the British are not free men. Dr. Masters is not a free man. He's a peasant. He's a serf who has a queen and some inbred royalty following her up after that. And of course the Canadians they're not free men either. And so they're looking at the Scripture through the lens of slaves, because they're slaves. And as slaves, they expect the government to take care of their health, because, slaves need a master. They need a master to give them food. They need a master to feed them or clothe them and provide them medicine. Well, I suppose you could say we're looking at it through the lens of free men, but I don't see the Scripture anywhere suggesting that it is a biblical role of government to take care of people's health. The government's job, according to, the Scripture, and I think that it is supported by, Western jurisprudence, English common law, the system of law handed to us through the philosophy of John Locke, who was, by the way, a Protestant reformer, is in the social compact theory of government, is that the purpose of government is to protect our lives and liberties. By life, I mean not to have it unjustly taken, by vagabonds and pirates. It is to protect our right to life. It's to protect our right to property. That's why the government exists. And so to restrict our liberty to worship God is actually the government doing wickedness. It's actually rewarding wickedness and punishing the good. So what Masters, what Dr. Masters would have to argue for this to make any sense, he would have to argue that it is in fact wicked for the church to gather on the Lord's Day, thereby making it acceptable for the church to be censured or silenced by the government. So to demonstrate the government can rightfully close the church, he would have to demonstrate it's wicked to meet on the Lord's Day for worship. Can Dr. Masters demonstrate that? And the answer is absolutely not. Who's right? Dr. MacArthur. Who's wrong? Dr. Masters. Any thoughts?
Yeah, he twists himself up a little bit later in the article, which is bound to happen when you start, as opposed to taking the biblical prescription for how to handle this and trying to sort of weave the world's standards into it. He says later in the article, quote, if coronavirus restrictions become unreasonable or too long or unequal, that would be the time to protest. But who gets to determine that, though? I mean, don't you have to go back to Scripture to figure this out? He's disconnected himself, and I don't know how old this article is.
By the way, I just want to point out,
maybe he's changed. I don't know.
That was the exact position of Dr. MacArthur before all this went down, and then that threshold was crossed, and then he became a protester. The difference between Peter Masters and John MacArthur is Peter Masters has a British level of tolerance for tyranny,
which is high,
right? Which is screaming high. And MacArthur had a California level of tolerance for tyranny, which is considerably higher than mine. And so, at the end of the day, if the government can decide that which is wicked, see, the government is to punish the wicked, but God gets to define what wickedness is. The Bible never gives the government the right to determine what wickedness is. The Bible does that. The government just punishes the wicked. And so until Masters can argue it's wicked to meet for worship during a chest cold, then I think it's sufficient to say that Masters is wrong, and it's probably his peasantry coming through his theology. The Bible is meant to be read and understood by free men, and the British are not free men.